The Thanksgiving Treasure, Chapter 11. Mr. Rehnquist's funeral was that Saturday, and while Dad was busy doing some work on his pickup, Grandma and I quietly got dressed and left for the funeral parlor without telling him. I had on my best church dress, which was yellow with brown and white rickrack trim, my black patent leather Mary Jane's with heavy white socks, and my hat, a navy blue sailor with a long ribbon down the back. Grandma wore her black dress she always wore to funerals, and her flat black hat with the pink rose on the side. I tied a brown ribbon on the fall bouquet I had made those weeks ago for Grandma and took it along for Mr. Rehnquist. We set off down the street to Jensen's funeral home, and when we got there we saw the hearse drawn up outside waiting. When we got inside, Mr. Jensen was there at the door to give us a memorial program and to help us sign the register. I wrote in my best penmanship and noticed that there were no other names above ours. We were the first ones there, and Mr. Jensen's assistant ushered us in. Grandma and I sat in the fourth row of the little chapel. We never liked to sit right in the front row at church either, but we always sat close enough so Grandma could hear well. This was the first funeral I had ever been to. I looked at the memorial program and saw that it told when Mr. Rehnquist was born and the date he died, and it had a nice sketch of the funeral parlor on the front. I thought it was even better than I could have drawn myself. Mrs. Jensen was playing the organ, which was up at the front of the room with the casket. There was one bouquet of flowers on the casket. We sat there for a while listening to Mrs. Jensen play the organ, and then Uncle Will came in and he sat next to us. I thought it was nice of him to come, since he hadn't even known Mr. Rehnquist until that last day. And in a few moments our preacher from the Presbyterian Church, Reverend Teasdale, came in, and he went to the lectern at the front of the chapel. He looked a little surprised when he saw me, and then he began to read from the Bible. I looked around and was startled to see that there was no one else there. Reverend Teasdale went right on, though, through the service, just as though we were a whole Sunday audience. Mrs. Jensen sang the Old Ragged Cross, and then the Reverend read a list of nice things about Mr. Rehnquist that I had never heard of, and it was all over. Mrs. Jensen came in and ushered Grandma and Uncle Will and me past the casket. We stood there for a few minutes and looked at him, and it wasn't scary the way I thought it would be at all. I tried to decide if I would say he looked good, the way people always did when they came back from a funeral. He didn't look crabby anyway, and I figured that was good. Then Grandma and I went outside, and she said this was where you wait for the casket to come out. You had to do that to show respect. Soon Mr. Jensen, his assistant, Uncle Will, and Reverend Teasdale carried the casket out and slid it into the hearse. Mr. and Mrs. Jensen drove the hearse to the cemetery, and Reverend Teasdale took Uncle Will and Grandma and me. At the cemetery, they moved the casket up to the hill where Mr. Rehnquist would be buried. We stood around the grave, and Reverend Teasdale said the Lord's Prayer in the 23rd Psalm, and then threw a handful of dirt over the casket. We stood there for a moment, and I wondered how it would feel to be asleep down in that dark hole with dirt over you. Then Grandma and I put our fall bouquet with Mr. Rehnquist's own cattails in it on the casket, and we went home. Grandma and I went in through the kitchen door, hoping we wouldn't run into Dad, but there he was, sitting at the kitchen table, going over some bills. "Where have you two been all dressed up like that?" he said, glancing at us. I bolted for my bedroom door. I've got to go change out of my good dress," I said, and disappeared. I didn't want to be there for the fireworks I was afraid might follow. "We've been downtown," I heard Grandma say as I left the kitchen. "Dressed like that?" asked Dad. "Yes," said Grandma. "Been to a funeral." "Who was it this time?" said Dad, sounding as though she went to funerals every day. "Would you like some coffee?" Grandma asked him, trying to change the subject. "Yes, I would." "Who was it?" he asked again. "Walter Rehnquist," she said. "Walter Rehnquist," Dad said absent-mindedly. Then suddenly he looked up. "Why did you go to Walter Rehnquist's funeral?" "He didn't have any family, so we went," said Grandma, acting very casual. "We?" said Dad, sounding surprised. "You mean Addie went with you?" "Of course." "Why did you take her?" He was a friend of hers, Grandma said quietly, so naturally she wanted to pay her last respects. I was listening carefully from behind my bedroom door as I changed. I figured this was it, and I was right. A friend of hers? Dad said incredulously. What the hell are you talking about? Calm down, James, said Grandma, and took him his coffee. Dad was not about to calm down. What do you mean he was a friend of hers? She didn't even know him. Well, yes, she did, James, said Grandma, trying to keep calm. How? She went out there to visit him a few times. Visit him? Roared Dad. What the hell was she doing out there? Addie, he shouted, getting up from the table. Come in here. I yanked on my sweater and I hesitantly went into the kitchen. I didn't do anything wrong, Dad. I just took him some Thanksgiving dinner. You what? He asked loudly. I knew he was your enemy, and Miss Thompson said we should make friends out of our enemies, and you wouldn't let him come here. Grandma interrupted. I think it was a very nice thing for her to do, James. Walter Rehnquist was a mighty lonely old man. Dad stood there looking from Grandma to me and back again. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard of, he said angrily. You knew that old goat owed me money. He wasn't an old goat, I said, angry myself. You knew I wouldn't want you going way out there. Well, said Grandma, I think it's a good thing she did. She found Mr. Rehnquist sick and got her Uncle Will. At least the old man didn't die alone. Dad looked at me, and I could tell he was really furious. I'm going to lock that bike up for a month, he said, and if you ever go that far out of town again, I'll take it away for good. And just then, someone knocked on the door. Please don't make a fuss, James, Grandma said to Dad as she went to answer the door. Addie's upset enough as it is. Think I'm not upset? He said. She could have gotten killed riding way out there. Grandma opened the door, and there stood a tall, skinny man with blond hair and a sharp Adam's apple. He was dressed in a dark blue overcoat and was carrying a briefcase. He said he was the lawyer for the Rehnquist estate and wanted to speak to James and Addie Mills. I had no idea what was going on, but I was glad that Dad's tirade had been interrupted. Mr. Burkhart told us that Mr. Rehnquist had left everything to his sister in Boise, Idaho. She had been too ill to come to the funeral, but Mr. Burkhart had come out to handle the estate. There was an addition to Rehnquist's will in the form of a letter, which he wanted to read to us. We all sat down around the kitchen table, and he pulled the letter out of his big briefcase. He cleared his throat, which made his sharp Adam's apple plunge up and down, and started to read. I, Walter Rehnquist, being of sound mind, do write this letter leaving to James Mills $234 as final payment for my pond, which I did not know was on a sand hole at the bottom. I looked over at Dad surprised, and he looked absolutely shocked. Mr. Burkhart continued reading. To Addie Mills, my faithful friend, I leave my horse Treasure, together with the saddle, bridle, and other equipment. Signed, Walter Rehnquist. I was numb. Wait a minute, said Dad, confused. What's this about a horse? Treasure, I mumbled almost to myself. He left me Treasure. Oh, Dad, isn't that great? Dad looked at me and then at Grandma. You didn't say anything about a horse. Grandma looked a bit guilty. Well, James, Mr. Rehnquist let Addie take care of his horse, and she rode it now and then. And isn't it wonderful that he left it to her? I could see from Dad's expression that he didn't think it was wonderful at all. Well, we'll talk about it later, Mother, he said ominously. Mr. Burkhart, having no idea of the bomb he had just dropped in the lap of our family, went right on taking care of his business. I'd appreciate it if you could go out and get the horse today, Mr. Mills, as there's no one at the farm to take care of it. I can't keep a horse, said Dad, sounding disgusted. Mr. Rehnquist left it to Addie, James, not to you, said Grandma. You know it's not possible for us to keep a horse, he said to her. We have no place to put it. We can't afford to feed it. If you don't want the animal, said Mr. Burkhart, I'll have to make some arrangements to get it until we can sell it, with the other farm equipment and household effects. Fine, said Dad. You sell it. She's not an it, she's a she, I interrupted angrily. And send Addie the money, care of our post office box 72, Dad continued. I don't want the money. I want Treasure, I said. Well, said Mr. Burkhart, if you don't want the horse, it becomes part of the estate. The estate will sell the horse and keep the money. I don't follow you, said Dad, frowning. That's ridiculous. Well, it may seem ridiculous to you, said Mr. Burkhart, but it was Mr. Rehnquist's intention to give your daughter the horse, not the money. Now, if you want to sell the horse after you get her, That's your business, but I can't do it for you." "Oh, I can't be bothered selling a horse," said Dad. "Just keep the damn thing." I was stunned at that decision and frantically tried to think of a way to save the situation. Mr. Burkhart was getting up to leave. Suddenly I realized I had to appeal to my father's practical side. "Wait a minute," I said as Mr. Burkhart started for the door. "Would you please wait a minute?" "Dad," I said, trying to sound conspiratorial, "Treasure's worth a lot of money. Why should anybody else get it? I'll help you sell her." Grandma caught on immediately. "Addie's right, James. It'll just be throwing away money, and we could use it." Dad looked a bit interested, and I was sure we had him hooked. Finally he spoke. "All right, Mr. Burkhart. We'll get the horse this afternoon. I don't know where we're going to keep it." Mr. Burkhart left, and Dad told me to get my coat and that he would go get the horse right now. He went to get his coat. Grandma and I looked at each other apprehensively. "I think you'd better come too, Grandma," I said. "Yes," she said, "I think I'd better."